everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on from where on the globe you're joining us. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce the last panel of this wonderful conference. My name is Chiara Caradonna, and I'm a lecturer at the Roman Studies Department of the Hebrew University. I will start by introducing our guests. And organizers of the conference. Ilana Pardes is a Catherine Cornell Professor of Comparative Literature at the Hebrew University and the Director of the Center for Literary Studies and of the Institute of Literatures. She is the author of several books, among them Counter Traditions in the Bible, published in 1992, Melville's Bibles, 2008, The Song of Songs, a biography, and more recently, Ruth, the Migrant Gleaner, which is forthcoming and about which I think we will hear today. Our second speaker is Vivian Liska. She is Professor of German Literature and Director of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp. She's also Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Faculty of the Humanities at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She has published extensively on literary theory, German modernism, and German Jewish authors and thinkers. In 2012, she was awarded the Cross of Honor for Sciences and the Arts from the Republic of Austria. Her recent books include George Agamben's Empty Messianism, published in German in 2008, When Kafka Says We, Uncommon Communities in German Jewish Literature, published in 2009, Fremde Gemeinschaft, Deutsch-Jüdische Literatur in der Moderne, and German Jewish Thought and its Afterlife, a Tenuous Legacy. She will speak today about Arendt's and Kafka's Abraham. Dines is an assistant professor of Yiddish studies and East European Jewish studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He currently serves as the head of the program of Yiddish language and literature and culture, and he has recently co-edited with Professor Naomi Zeidman of the University of Toronto a collection of essays entitled The Beginnings of Modern Jewish Literature in Europe. His talk is titled Janusz Korczak's Bible. And our final speaker, last but not least, Amir Eshel, who teaches German studies and comparative literature at Stanford University, where he is also serving as Edward Clark Crosset Professor of Humanistic Studies. His most recent book, Poetic Thinking Today, was published in 2009. He will speak about Dani Karavan and the sacredness of the person. I ask you to pose your questions to me in the chat. I will then give you the possibility to talk after the first round of discussion among the panel speakers. And without further ado, Ilana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chiara, for this lovely introduction, and thank all of you for these amazing panels. I mean, the problem about being in the final panel is that I would have liked to respond to each and every one of you, so I'll restrain myself, but occasionally I will try to do so. I'm going to present a fragment of my new book on the Book of Ruth, and the main line of interest is actually reading the Book of Ruth as a story of migration and exploring the afterlives of Ruth from late antiquity until today. So there's one point that is related to the question of human rights, and that is gleaning. And so anyways, it will give you a taste of what gleaning is all about in the Book of Ruth. There are no villains in the Book of Ruth. In fact, one of the tale's stunning literary feats is its convincing portrayal of good people. It is a rare world in which chesed, kindness, or loving kindness, emerges as a cherished principle of human relations. Ruth is the primary agent of chesed and is hailed for it time and again. But other characters are also construed as kind and compassionate. Even Orpah, who unlike Ruth, decides to head back to Moab instead of following her mother-in-law to Bethlehem, is not wicked. Naomi thanks Orpah for her chesed and care while urging her to return to her mother's house. She's a good person, just less good than Ruth. God too has a pivotal role in advancing chesed, but he remains behind the scenes. He's not really a character, and his voice is not heard. it is primarily human agency and human goodness that shape the drama in the Book of Ruth. In a talk on goodness delivered in 2012, Toni Morrison points out that contemporary literature is not interested in goodness on a large scale or even limited scale. When it appears, it is with a note of apology in its hand and has trouble speaking its name. Critical of this tendency, she harks back to 19th century writers who did not hesitate to explore the far from bland lives of good people. Biblical narrative, strangely enough, is not that different from modern literature in its suspicion of goodness. The biographies of prominent biblical figures are usually replete with scenes of jealousy, cheating, and violence. Jacob tricks his brother Esau, Leah and Rachel engage in fierce struggles over Jacob's love, and Joseph's brothers fling him into the pit. Ruth's biography, with its substantive attention to goodness, is a rare exception to the rule. Ruth, in a sense, is a precursor of Herman Melville's Billy Budd, and even more so of George Eliot's Dorothea, the protagonist of Middlemarch, whose unconditional devotion to her husband Casaubon is one of the most intriguing aspects of the novel. Good characters are not flawless, nor are their lives necessarily less miserable or devoid of tensions, but they have a unique light, exceptional generosity that compels all who surround them, even those who try to deny their fascination. A few preliminary comments before we move on to talk about gleaning in the Book of Ruth. In Nomos and Narrative, this is really a remarkable piece. Robert Cover claims that no set of legal institutions or prescriptions exists apart from the narrative that locates it and gives it meaning. Once understood in the context of the narrative that gives it meaning, the law becomes not merely a system of rules to be observed, but a world in which we live. This is all the more relevant to the Bible, where law and narrative are inextricably connected. The copious corpus of the law in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy is set within the story of the wanderings of the children of Israel in the wilderness. Even more intriguing are the cases in which the law is part and parcel of the narrative. More often than not, the embeddedness of the law in narrative, especially in Samuel and Kings, highlights the fragility of the law and the all too common human tendency to violate it. Time and again, we witness kings from David to Ahab who set themselves above the law and are punished for doing so. The Book of Ruth offers a strikingly different trajectory. The goodness that prevails in the Book of Ruth allows us to imagine the pivotal role the law may have in transforming the lives of people and rescuing innocent sufferers. But differently, Ruth's Tales humanizes the law and spells out its benefits. I mean, what matters really is law and life. It's not an abstract set of codes. There are several laws that form part of the legal nexus of the Book of Ruth: the Law of Gleaning, the Levirate Law, and the Law of Redemption. We'll focus on gleaning, the closest to modern perceptions of human rights, though here too, of course, there are noticeable differences. The Law of Gleaning is part of the biblical welfare system intended to supply the most impoverished, the stranger, Agil, the orphan, Hayatom, and the widow, Almana, with minimal source of sustenance. The law is addressed to the landowner as a duty, but while spelling out the field owner's obligation, it defines those who have the right to glean. I know we've talked a lot about duties and rights in the past few days, and of course, the right to glean is only implicitly so in the law. But I think that if we think in today's term, we could sort of spill out the right that is included in it. And this is what I'm trying to say. Altogether, I've found this conversation about apologetics, or the ways in which we treat ancient texts, is a very fascinating one. And obviously we speak different languages in this conference, which makes it all the more interesting. So coming from literature as I do, I just want to mention the fact that, of course, literature and history were not given on Mount Sinai either. So when we talk about the relevance of terms like human rights, I think we could just as well say something about literature or history. And when the historical approach was introduced, the documentary hypothesis was introduced, of course, people claimed that it was inapplicable to the biblical text as a theological text, and the same happened when the literary approach was introduced, not to mention feminism. Now, of course, there's no history, no literature, and no feminism in the Bible, and no human rights. But on the other hand, if we go back to Walter Benjamin, invitation to think of afterlives, what kind of cultural translation may we endorse in approaching ancient texts? And I wholly agree with Naftali that at the same time, we need to respect the otherness of the biblical text. But while doing so, taking into account that we necessarily use modern concepts. So this is really in a nutshell, but maybe in the discussion we can expand. So I'm going back to gleaning. So it is addressed to the landowner as a duty, but far from being a dry decree, the law of gleaning is based on an ethical call to acknowledge suffering through identification. And you should remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God ransomed you from there. Therefore do I charge you to do this thing. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget the sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to take it. For the sojourner and for the orphan and for the widow it shall be, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Knowing only too well what being wretched means, the people of Israel are required to ensure the well-being of the outcasts and strangers in their midst. Interestingly enough, the leftover sheaves in the field are not simply given to the poor as an act of charity. They must toil for such social benefits. The framing of the law makes the requirement less of an expense for the owners, but it also has the poor in mind. Gleaners are given the opportunity to take an active role in securing their livelihood, to preserve their agency. They too have responsibilities, and here I'm indebted to Benny Porat's observations in this connection of the sort of interpersonal responsibility. Unlike the reapers, they do not get paid for their work, but gleaning provides them, or it is meant to provide them, with enough to sustain themselves. So let's go back to the Book of Ruth. Ruth, who sets out to glean shortly after their arrival in Bethlehem, has the right to glean both as a gera, as a gel, and as a widow, but she doesn't take this right for granted. Her conduct in the field is exemplary. She's a law-abiding gleaner who limits herself to gathering only leftover ears of grain that have fallen from the sheaves, which is why she remains behind the reapers. Now this apparently, by the way, there's a whole sort of reception of the law of gleaning in Europe from the Middle Ages until the 18th century, where you have lawsuits concerning the regulation of gleaning. And one of the problems is precisely that. I mean, what do you count as leftovers? And when does it become closer to theft? And disputes about this issue between farmers, between the village poor, between the authorities. So Ruth is a law-abiding gleaner. I mean, she sort of assumes her role in being responsible for abiding by the regulations. Within the limits of and she's extremely diligent, standing there as she does in the fields from the morning on, presumably without a moment of rest. Within the limits of what women migrants could possibly achieve in the biblical world, Ruth manages to do precisely what Joseph does in Potiphar's house and later in Pharaoh's palace, to find favor, to be singled out in a way that allows her gradually to gain unexpected privileges. A touch of romance is introduced into the scene when the field owner, Boaz, appears and asks the overseer, "Whose is this young woman?" After hearing the overseer's favorable account of the young Moabite gleaner, Boaz's interest in Ruth is aroused further, and he ventures to address her directly, endowing Ruth with a privileged position among the gleaners. Ruth is invited to join the young women who reap in his field and is granted permission to ask the lads to draw water from the well should she be thirsty. In responding to Boaz's generosity, Ruth must remain humble. And she fell on her face and bowed to the ground and said to him, "Why should I find favor in your eyes to recognize me when I am a foreigner? In legal terms, Ruth is closer to the position of the Gael, but in choosing to define herself as Nochuria, she underscores her sense of acute estrangement and making her first steps in an unknown land. The term Nochuri may also designate a figurative internal sense of alienation, and Job is a wonderful example. So it's not only a legal term, it's also a figurative statement about a sense of inner alienation. Her self-deprecation, however, may also be seen as an attempt to be cautious in handling those in power. When the fugitive David encounters Saul in one of the caves of En-Gedi, he declares, "After whom has the king of Israel come forth? After whom are you chasing? After a dead dog? After a single flea?" Ruth is not as wily as her descendant, but she realizes what migrants and fugitives must realize if they want to survive. That self-deprecating is a vital strategy. While belittling herself, Ruth compliments Boaz. Her rhetorical ingenuity is evident in her juggling of two antithetical words, recognize and foreigner, that share in common the same root, nun kaf resh. Instead of ignoring her, playing the stranger to the stranger, Nochuria, he ventures to recognize her, Lakireni. A more standard reply to Boaz's generosity would have been a humble note of gratitude. But Ruth complicates her praise as she lays bare the grim truth. Strangers usually remain invisible. Why then has Boaz chosen to recognize her, to treat her as visible? This is not a complaint, of course, but a way of highlighting Boaz's unusual choice while urging him to reflect on it. There's a spark between the two. Boaz's response has its own flair. Spelling out his reasons for recognizing her, he depicts Ruth's conduct as nothing less than Abrahamic in character. And Boaz answered and said, "It was indeed told me all that you did for your mother-in-law after your husband's death, and that you left your mother and your father and the land of your birth to come to a people that you did not know in time past. May your reward be complete from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to shelter." Boaz's words call to mind the inaugural divine message to Abraham in Genesis, "Go forth, lech lecha, from your land and your birthplace and your father's house to the land I will show you." The analogy Boaz draws between Ruth and Abraham adds grandeur to the Moabites' migration to the land of Judah, as it underscores the audacity and the sacrifice entailed in severing one's closest ties and moving to a strange new place. Ruth, Boaz insists, is no lonely foreigner, but rather an admirable woman whose capacity for rupture, her capacity to leave home and homeland, is as monumental as that of the founding patriarch of the Israelites. That she left Moab for the sake of her mother-in-law makes her all the more worthy of being rewarded by God. In a way, he's intimating that, that there's something contagious about chesed, about goodness, and he's sort of responding to her act of chesed with his own generosity. The Book of Ruth is a profound meditation on humanity, and as such avoids idealization. Ruth and Boaz are not flawless. Ruth stealthily goes down to the threshing floor at night in order to seduce Boaz, and Boaz's generosity has its limits. During the encounter in the field, Boaz doesn't mention the fact that he's a kinsman of Elimelech, and as such might have an even greater responsibility towards the new gleaner in his field. It is only later, on the threshing floor, that he will be spurred on to assuming his role as Goel, Redeemer. It's not a perfect utopian world. What is more, we receive no guarantee that good deeds are necessarily rewarded. In other words, the Book of Ruth, and it offers with this, it sort of begins with this great line of Naomi, which is really Job-like. She says, Anochi mele'ah halachti ve'reka meshivani Adonai, sort of quarreling with God over the misery, the innocent suffering in her life. So we really don't get any theodicy here. No explanation for the deaths of Elimelech, Kilion, and Machlon, or the famine. And yet within the framework of this imperfect world in which scarcity, death, and dislocation hover in the background, there's something inspiring in the acknowledgement of the value of goodness and of the law. The law of gleaning may seem to be a marginal law in the biblical corpus, but the Book of Ruth makes us realize that it surely matters, not only for the lives of those who all too often remain invisible, but also for the lives of those who are capable of seeing them, of recognizing strangers. Had we world enough and time, I'd say more about the reception of this scene of gleaning. But to give you at least a taste of the captivating world of Ruth's afterlives, I'll end with one of my favorites, John Keats' Ode to a Nightingale from 1819. In Keats' reading of Ruth, the darker facets of the scene in the field are set into relief. Ruth is a solitary, sad, migrant gleaner. Boaz is nowhere to be seen. And yet the speaker himself, and Keats by extension, assumes Boaz's role, as it were, in making Ruth's plight and power visible. Ruth emerges at the dramatic moment in which the speaker realizes that while the nightingale and her song are destined to be immortal, he cannot escape his humanity. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the selfsame song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth when sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. Ruth seems to lure the speaker to seek inspiration where it is least expected, in the unheard song of a Moabite woman whose future as she gleans in the fields of Bethlehem is still far from promising. In Ruth, Keats finds something the nightingale lacks, the kind of human resilience to continue gleaning or singing, even amid the alien corn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilana, for this wonderful insight into Ruth and the right of gleaning. Vivian, the floor is yours.
Yesterday, Sam Moyne, in his provocative opening lecture, said toward the end of his talk that the only way the Bible could have something to do with human rights was there where it is alien or strange. I'm quoting, I hope correctly. Like all great literature, the Bible indeed escapes the stereotypes attached to it. And in my talk, I intend to move toward a place where the Bible defies such flattening expectations. Now, it may seem far-fetched to associate human rights and the Bible with Arendt and Kafka. After all, Arendt and the Bible is not a great match, and even Kafka and human rights isn't either. Yet I suggest that this unlikely constellation can offer instructive insights about possible affinities between the Bible, literature, and human rights. In Placeless People, a recent book on modern statelessness, Lindsay Stonebridge states that Arendt's, quote, critique of human rights was forged, at least in part, from her reading of fiction and in particular from the work she did on Kafka in the mid-1940s. Stonebridge refers to Arendt's essays from 1944, The Jew as Pariah, and Franz Kafka, A Revaluation. These two texts approach the Prague author in the context of exile, homelessness, and the vulnerability of the stranger, a situation Arendt herself faced in those years. These essays prefigure the critique of human rights that Arendt would formulate a few years later in The Decline of the Nation State and the End of the Rights of Man. In that essay, she points to the weakness, to the feebleness of human rights when and where they are most needed. Dependent for their implementation upon the status of citizenship in the nation state, they fail to protect the stateless, the refugees, and more generally those who don't belong to a legal entity that can enforce these rights. Stonebridge describes Arendt's use of Kafka as a thought experiment that contrasts such rightlessness with what Stonebridge calls, quote, a different kind of political and ethical community, a possible future. Stonebridge's insight into Arendt's use of Kafka to diagnose the ills of human rights is illuminating. But her affirmation and support of Arendt's view that Kafka's fiction provides a cure for these tribulations is less plausible. Arendt does indeed depict Kafka's protagonists, particularly the land surveyor K in the castle, as ultimate strangers, as embodiments of the vulnerability experienced by those who belong nowhere, are not recognized by anyone, and are, in Kafka's words, nobodies and nothings. These human non-entities serve as a literary adumbration of Arendt's portrayal of the stateless, those who are left defenseless in the face of rising nationalism and its exclusionary and homogenizing politics. Arendt's analysis of the plight of Kafka's protagonists is compelling, but I do question her suggestion, so it's not just Stonebridge, it's actually Arendt's, that Kafka also delivers solutions, visions of a new social order that would guarantee such rights. Now, this is not to say that Kafka's figures have no potential impact on their world at all. And asking for that impact is in some ways asking for what literature can and what it cannot do. Arendt formulates the potential of Kafka's figures succinctly in her reading of The Castle as a minimal yet crucial act of resistance. Arendt portrays K's distinguishing, so that's the protagonist of The Castle, distinguishing feature as a refusal to submit to the castle's authority. She can only give scant evidence for this feature of Kafka's protagonist. Indeed, the novel offers barely more than hints to such a resistance. And in a later reference to Kafka in her preface to the revised 1968 edition of Between Past and Future, Arendt intuits that she must go, and I'm quoting, a step further than Kafka. And she adds there that she hopes that it will not falsify Kafka's perspective, but that one has actually to go a step further. It is in the context of a text where she quotes Kafka for dreaming to jump out of history altogether. And there Arendt would say, no, that would be going a bit too far in a critique of history. So Arendt feels that she must go a step further than Kafka to align him with her own vision of the possibilities for political intervention. Surprisingly, Arendt and Kafka find common ground in their references to the biblical figure of Abraham. Both Arendt and Kafka invoke Abraham's confrontations with divine authority, and both derive from his attitude, somewhat modified in their pen, the indispensable starting point to conceive of human rights, that no one is a nobody, and that by virtue of being somebody, everybody, even the lowliest of human beings, can contest the reigning authority and thereby intervene in the world. So Arendt's reading of Kafka. Even a perfunctory reading of Arendt's The Jewish Pariah reveals its vicinity to her early writings about human rights, a term she repeatedly mentions in her essay. The introduction to this essay assesses the pariah as a human type who is, quote, refused admission to the ranks of humanity. In the final section of the essay, Arendt portrays the land surveyor K as the man of goodwill who wants nothing else but the right to live a decent life and to be admitted in a society that persists in excluding him. In the village dominated by the opaque powers of the castle, K remains a powerless outsider, alone in his hopeless efforts. He ultimately dies of exhaustion. It is not so clear that he really dies, but that's because Arendt read Broad's version, and in Broad's version he dies. For Arendt, he definitely does not succeed. For Arendt, Kafka's novel points to the hopelessness of the exiled, the homeless, and the displaced, as well as to all those who believe that, quote, playing along or blending into the established society can actually solve their plight. Arendt writes of the protagonist of the castle. K finally comes to understand that the realization of his designs, the achievement of basic human rights, the right to work, to be useful, the right to found a home and become a member of society, are in no way dependent on complete assimilation to one's milieu, on becoming indistinguishable. In Arendt's view, K's fatal exhaustion results from the failures of a system that did not protect him and a community that did not grant him access. Yet Arendt suggests that his presence in the village did bring about a significant change. He left the villagers with the sense that confrontation with the authority is possible. K points out the bankruptcy of the world of the castle as a bureaucratic society that demands subordination and assimilation. I quote, the very fight, Arendt, the very fight he had put up to obtain the few basic things which society owes to men had opened the eyes of the villagers, or at least of some of them. His story, his behavior had taught them both that human rights are worth fighting for and that the rule of the castle is not divine law and consequently can be attacked. End of quote. Arendt distinguishes here between the rule of the castle and divine law and implicitly suggests that divine law is beyond contestation. Now, this distinction contrasts with Arendt's reference to a biblical passage in which the individual is empowered to intervene in God's ways. In the human condition, Arendt reflects on the mutual covenantal promise God gave to Abraham. And I'm quoting, we may trace, quote, the binding status of the promise. So it is in the context of thinking about the meaning of promise. We may trace the binding status of the promise back to the Roman legal system, the inviolability of agreements and treaties, pacta sunt servanda, or we may see its discoverer in Abraham, the man from Ur, whose whole story, as the Bible tells it, shows such a passionate drive toward making covenants that it is as though he departed from his country for no other reason than to try out the power of mutual promise in the wilderness of the world, until eventually God himself agreed to make a covenant with him. Kierkegaard, whose works influenced Arendt in her youth, regarded Abraham as the embodiment of submission and a knight of faith. In contrast, Arendt stages Abraham as a daring challenger of God. In her version, Abraham sets out into the wilderness without guarantee that God will keep his word to give him progeny and provide his descendants with a homeland. Leaving his place of birth and venturing into the desert, he subjects himself and his progeny to the risk of becoming, as it says, a stranger in a land that is not theirs. Abraham compels God to keep his side of the promise and thereby becomes the forefather of those who hold authority, even ultimate authority, to account. In the words of one critic, Arendt's portrayal of Abraham as the one who challenged God into making a covenant turns him into the initiator, quote, of law as politically binding. More importantly, Abraham thereby becomes an active agent who forces God into keeping his side of the promise. Maybe the word forcing is a bit too strong. As a result, Abraham becomes the forefather, indeed, of those who hold authority accountable and who act upon this right, even in the face of ultimate power. Arendt's reading might somewhat overstate Abraham's action upon God's designs, but it undeniably captures a fundamental insight. Through the figure of Abraham, the Bible suggests a mutual covenant enforced by man and affirms the ineluctable participation of human action in shaping the world. In this sense, Abraham is also a somewhat more successful precursor of Kafka's K as seen by Arendt, a figure she calls a fabricator mundi, a world builder who can get rid of misconstruction and reconstruct the world. It can seem overly optimistic to call Kafka's K an architect of the world. A more modest version of this claim, and I think that this advice to go with more modest claims counts for human rights altogether, but that's a side thought. A more modest version of this claim would be that the Bible affords man the right to stand up for himself and expect accountability of the powers that be. This claim represents, maybe in its own right, a significant precondition for human rights. Now, Kafka's Abraham. I can imagine another Abraham. This is the first sentence of a text Kafka included in a letter to Klopstock in June 1921. Kafka's remark, even more directly than Arendt's, responds to Kierkegaard's praise of Abraham's submissiveness. Kafka imagines another Abraham, one who, unlike the biblical one, would not ascend to Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son. Like the biblical patriarch, Kafka's other Abraham is a pious man and would be ready to execute the command to sacrifice Isaac, quote, with the promptness of a waiter. Kafka's Abraham, however, would still never be able to perform the sacrifice. In an imaginary reply to God, his Abraham argues that he cannot get away from home. He's indispensable. The household needs him. There's always something that still must be done. The house isn't finished. And hasn't God himself, as Kafka writes, it is written in the Bible, commanded him to care for his household, to build a home, a world? Later, Kafka elaborates on Abraham's excuses for procrastinating rather than obeying God's command. His other Abraham now stands in the plural. He has become a type, or better, an existential attitude. The other Abrahams, Kafka writes, they stand on their building sites and suddenly have to go up on Mount Moriah. These Abrahams, as imagined by Kafka, are called by God while attending to their home, their world building, as much as Kafka's other Abrahams would otherwise have been willing to oblige. They declare themselves too immersed in the care of their house to heed the divine summons. Now, Kafka speculates about the motivation of this refusal. Quote, all we can do is suspect that these men are deliberately not finishing their houses so as not to have to lift their eyes and see the mountain that stands in the distance. Rather than staring at the awesome mountain of sacrifice, these Abrahams turn this house, the world, into an infinite and infinitely improvable building site. The immaterial foundations of this house manifest themselves in the story as a politely irreverent refusal of the sacrificial logic Abraham is summoned to obey, a logic that the Bible itself, in halting Abraham's knife, ultimately rejects. And to end, however far Arendt's and Kafka's portrayals of Abraham deviate from the biblical text, they are not arbitrary distortions. Abraham's negotiations with God are already laid out in the Bible itself. His haggling with God, as in the context of the divine plan to destroy Sodom, prefigures other biblical figures wrestling with divine authority, foremost among them Moses, several prophets, and most hauntingly the suffering Job. In attributing the right to contest the existing legal, moral, or political authority to Abraham, the model of righteousness, The Bible grants man the right to speak up for himself and protest in the face of injustice. This freedom is not only a foundation of human rights, but also potential and central to literature. Human rights are thereby not rendered obsolete by their weakness, powerlessness to be enforced, dependence on extraneous legal entities, vulnerability to abuse, and inevitably biased implementation. These constitutive weaknesses, still with us today, are manifestations of the necessarily utopian nature of the entire human rights endeavor and symptoms of the impossibility to conclusively rectify the world, to finish Abraham's house. The contributions human rights makes to improving it are indisputable, but they remain a precarious, perennial, and to a large extent weak construction site. Kafka suggests that his Abraham have good reason to deliberately build houses that cannot be finished. In focusing on improving the worldly building site, Kafka's Abraham does not deny that the mountain is there in the distance, but he asserts the primacy of his world building in a dialogue with God that, in polite defiance, while averting his eyes from the fear and trembling inspired by the mountain and its potential sacrificial site. Doing so too narrowly, however, so fixing one's sight solely on the house to be built, and we can reflect here on the narrow sense in which we ought to understand human rights, as suggested by Sam in his opening speech, may prevent us from seeing that mountain there as the place where early on, along with the commandments, also a source and precondition of human rights, the right to stand up and hold authority accountable was accorded. While Abraham continues to toil on his building site, Kafka himself, telling us this, thus defiantly includes the mountain in the picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for this very inspiring talk. I'm sure many thoughts. And now the floor goes to Amir Eshel.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for the introduction, for chairing the session. And I'd like to also thank Ilana and Vivian and Leora for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conference. I have to tell all of you that I believe you created something incredibly powerful and beautiful in the various conferences which you gathered in recent years, and you have my highest admiration to your endeavors. So let's start here. I would also like to say that, you know, it's a special pleasure and an honor, and I'm very moved by the fact that I get the chance, the opportunity to talk about Dani Karavan today. As Ilana mentioned yesterday, Dani Karavan passed about 10 days ago, and the incredible person he was. It's just wonderful that we were able to go back to his body of work and to his person also, because he was an activist, not just someone who creates art, but someone who engages in the public sphere. So to honor him today is a great honor for me personally. Before I share the screen, I'd like to say that listening to the various talks over the last 2 days, I have the impression that beyond mapping the various ways in which the Bible and human rights are in conversation with each other as two, let's call it discourses for a moment, there's also an implicit, may I say, a message to this conference and to this junction. And the message is, I'll kind of put my cards on the table, the message is that it seems to me to be indicating, the various contributions seems to me to be indicating that a purely secularist framework of our understanding of human rights is insufficient. That we need to broaden in a way our understanding of the notion of human rights beyond the purely secularist agenda. And that's something, you know, we may want to talk about in the following discussion. But one thing the Bible and human rights offers us as a conjunction is the ability to have a conversation across the divide separating, you know, secularists from those who have a different approach to what it means for a human being to be a human being, and what does it mean for a human being to have rights in the modern era. And I'm saying what I'm saying, also reflecting on Sam Moyne's very important and provocative opening remarks yesterday. Sam is not with us in the room today, but were he to be here, that's something I would love to debate with him. Namely, to what extent you know, he sees himself as being in conversation with the debate that's been going on in recent years around the normative deficit of a purely secularist agenda. And again, that's something, you know, we may want to go back to in the discussion. So on that note, I'll share my screen and then we can go to the work of Dani Karavan. Let's see if I can move. Somehow I get the, oh, okay, cancel. Okay. And slideshow and play from start. We have here Dani Karavan in front of us with his contagious smile, something I'm sure all of us who had the chance to experience him will always remember. So my point of departure today is by saying that I take Moshe Halbertal's points yesterday very seriously, and I adopt them for my talk today. I see Karavan's work as engaging the Bible in countless ways. In fact, I see it as highlighting what Moshe Halbertal described in his talk yesterday as the moral breakthrough implied in the Bible. Karavan's work, in my view, first underlines the emergence in the Bible of the category of the human, and secondly, it explicates throughout what this category may mean today. Karavan's work expresses the desire to overcome tribalism, often tribalism in contemporary Israel, through the category of the human. And I'll try to highlight or to explain what I mean by it as we talk about various artworks. For Karavan, it is crucial to emphasize the category of the human in the public sphere. That's crucial for him and also crucial for me and my reading or understanding of his work. His artwork seeks to encourage and cultivate human gathering. His art creates places in which we can observe each other's humanity. And thus I see his work in conjunction with such notions as Hannah Arendt's plurality, Martin Buber's Ich und Du, or Levi Nassel's Space of the Other. His public works are spaces in which we may debate with others our differences, not least regarding what the human or human rights may actually mean. And by debate, I also mean debates across the divide between those who are secularists, purely secularists, and those who hold on to various religious creeds. Now, here are two examples of how Dani Karavan's works operate in the public sphere. The upper image, and I'm circling here with my cursor, is his work in Regensburg in Germany, a work he has done on the very same location where the synagogue in Regensburg used to stand until its destruction. And as we see here, it's a place of gathering. It's not a memorial to a synagogue, but rather a place of gathering. When I visited the site a few years ago while riding on Karavan, there was a school class, gathering at this place. It was marvelous to see how the children make use of this space. The image here at the bottom is a work by Dani Karavan in Berlin, a work dedicated to the German Constitution, in which Karavan etched on transparencies all the articles of the German Constitution in a way that enables passerbys and viewers to read the Constitution, and as you see here with this little family standing in front of the first article, to actually have a conversation about what the Constitution means. So this is regarding the public sphere, and we can return to it perhaps in our discussion. I move forward. For Dani Karavan, the notion of the human as created in the image of God is crucial in bridging the divide among varying, at times contradictory ideas regarding the political sphere. For example, questions such as what is a right, who should enjoy which rights are human rights, etc., etc. Now, for my talk today, and I'm just touching on it, I won't go into it into depth, but for my talk today, a crucial interlocutor is Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist, perhaps founder of the discipline in many ways. And the quote you have here on the screen in front of us, in which Durkheim says, the human person whose definition serves as the touchstone according to which good must be distinguished from evil is considered as sacred in what one may call the ritual sense of the word. It has something of that transcendental majesty which the churches of all times have given to their gods. It is conceived as being invested with that mysterious property which creates an empty space around holy objects, which keeps them away from profane contacts. Whoever makes an attempt on a man's life, on a man's liberty, on a man's honor, inspires us with a feeling of horror in every way analogous to that which the believer experiences when he sees his idol profaned. Now, I see Durkheim as a very important bridging figure in our journey from the Bible, from biblical texts, to the modern notion of human rights. Excuse me. And the way in which Durkheim goes here back to the notion of the sacred, I think, is illuminating and very important for our discussion. Now, I use here, the quote I bring here, I found in Hans Joas's book, The Sacredness of the Person, a New Genealogy of Human Rights. I take the work of Hans Joas, a contemporary social thinker, again, as a very important thinker in bridging that divide between antiquity, the Bible, and the our modern notion of human rights. We have here an image of Hans Joas's book. Okay, now to Karavan himself, and let me see if I can somehow play with the screen in a way that doesn't obscure your view. I begin with one of the very early works by Dani Karavan, his work in the Tel Aviv Court of Justice, in which Karavan started by creating the entry hall for the Court of Justice. This is a work called the City Gate. You have here in front of you this beautiful metal construction. And the fact that this is called the City Gate is no coincidence, because the City Gate evokes the tradition of the prophets and the judges sitting at the City Gate, debating various legal matters who come to their attention or are brought in front of them. As you walk inside the building itself, you will find beautiful concrete reliefs spread all around the building. So people who attend the court for various reasons are confronted with various aspects of biblical texts as they touch on questions of the law. So here is one relief. I'm circling it with my cursor, the lower one, where you also see the hand. This is a quotation from Exodus 23:7. Have nothing to do as imperative, have nothing to do with a false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death. Similarly, another concrete relief from the same building, this early work by Dani Karavan, quotes Isaiah 11:6, the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. And those beautiful reliefs are all over the building for people to behold, to reflect on, to have a conversation with others about their meaning. Another aspect of Karavan's work in the Tel Aviv Court of Justice is a work in the garden, in the patio kind of inside the building itself. The title of the work is Justice, the Measuring Line, and Righteousness, the Plumb Line. Again, a biblical reference from Isaiah. I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plummet. Now you see here at the center of this work, you see this scroll on which the children are sitting. Again, this is when the day, this day where I visited the site. And what is etched on the scroll, what is etched onto it is Exodus chapter 21, the beginning of Parashat Mishpatim, the very foundation of biblical or Jewish jurisprudence. Now, when you kind of zoom into the image I just showed you, you can see that the child who was sitting there kind of taking shelter from the sun can actually touch the law. He can actually touch Parashat Mishpatim. So for Karavan, these foundations of Jewish jurisprudence and the law are not something lofty, abstract up there in the sky, but really something which demands, which calls for a visceral human touch. Now we're turning to Dani Karavan's The Way of Human Rights, the image we have on the poster for our conference, a wonderful work in the city of Nuremberg. We see Dani Karavan here in front of his work. The Way of Human Rights in German, Straße der Menschenrechte, was selected in 1988 by a 12-person jury. It was inaugurated in 1993. The work is set on the street between the new and the old buildings of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum, connecting Kornmarkt Street and the medieval city wall. Now, this museum, Germanisches Nationalmuseum, of course, resonates already in its name the entire history of the city of Nuremberg, the Nuremberg laws, the gathering of the Nazi party, the fact that Nuremberg was Hitler's favorite city because it kept its medieval character. And this museum, trying to bring itself, to the modern era, created this new part of the museum and invited artists to compete in a competition which Dani Karavan ended up winning. The work itself, these pillars we see in front of us, 27 round pillars, are made of white concrete. 2 pillars are buried in the ground, showing only a round plate, and one oak, which you see here on the image, is also a part of it. So we have 30 pillars, 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Each article is presented in German, and then in one of the languages spoken by people touched by various aspects of the racial ideology, the racial madness. So there is also an invocation of the suffering caused by the very racial ideology for which the name of the city of Nuremberg stands like a cipher, like a symbol. Now, one may very well ask if Karavan's work is just a tool in trying to kind of undo or cast away Nuremberg's historical shade. Is Karavan, collaborating with the attempt to rebrand Nuremberg as the city of human rights? I think this is not the case, and I'll give a few examples why I think this is not the case. Since 1993 inauguration of the human rights, the Way of Human Rights, Nuremberg has created a municipal human rights office. So it's not just a rebranding, but it's also a serious communal attempt to do something about human rights, which this work engendered or brought about. The city now regularly awards the International Nuremberg Human Rights Prize. Since 1999, Nuremberg is hosting the biannual Nuremberg International Human Rights Film Festival. And lastly, alongside the municipal activities, an independent human rights center was established in the city to support the defense of human rights throughout the world. So I see the work as actively participating in the cultivation, in the protection of human rights, and not just offering visitors an opportunity to engage in artwork and to rebrand the city and what the city has to offer. Now, when we look at the image here at the left side of the slide, we see that people walking by these pillars, we see the way they're observing the writing on the pillars with the view vertically, kind of directed vertically. I'm reminded when I'm considering the way these people in front of us engage the work, I'm very much reminded of Emil Durkheim's quote with which I began. And here we have italicized, such notions as the sacred, the ritual, the majesty, holy objects, etc. And that's something we may want to reflect on, the ways in which the very constitution of this artwork tries to capture the sacred, the ritualistic, the majesty, or even connecting to the tradition of the holy itself in the way it conceives of the notion of human rights. In other words, I see it, and I see this vertical gaze as indicating that one needs to somehow bridge or rethink the divide between the secularist discourse, which engendered or brought about the notion of human rights, and our old tradition, our antique tradition of what it means to be a human, and at the center of it, of course, the notion of humans as created in the image of God. I see Karavan's work as capturing this notion of humans as created in the image of God, also in the verticality of the gaze, which the work itself offers. Now, this work is not just an artwork, I'd like to suggest. It also has a political edge to it. I think it's no coincidence at all that Article 15, the article about the right to have a nationality, the right to belong to a nation, that this specific article is given in Nuremberg in Hebrew letters. This could be a gesture toward the history of Zionism in its inception and the ways in which Zionism offered a reaction to that moment in history in which many Jews were deprived of the right to have nationality and to have a place to belong to. But I also see in it an invitation for Israeli visitors walking today the way of human rights in Nuremberg to see in Hebrew also something about their own reality and the fact that many people living in Israel today who are not Jewish do not have the right for their own nationality and do not have the right to have a Beit Leumi, a national home. So I see it also as a provocation, as an intentional provocation by the artist to encourage those Israelis walking that street to think about their own place vis-a-vis the rights of others to have a national home. Now, this artwork is set between two gates. One gate is the old gate of the city of Nuremberg, which we see here in front of us on the left side of the slide. And right by it, there is a wall commemorating victims of neo-Nazi activities all over Germany. That's a very interesting component of the way in which this urban space is organized. On the other side of that way of human rights, on the other entry to this space, there is a part of Karavan's artwork itself, another arch, a modern arch created here in white marmor, white concrete, excuse me. And I'm going now with a circle to one interesting element in it. And the element you see here, I'm circling with the cursor, Hebrew letters saying Lo Tirtzach, right over here. So as you enter the way of human rights, Lo Tirtzach is right at the entrance to the artwork, right over here. And only then you enter the way of human rights. Yeah. Now, a close-up, that's the way it looks like when you get closer. I take this to be going back again to our point of departure, Moshe Halbertal's lecture from yesterday, I see in this quote, in this reference, a clear indication regarding that moment of breakthrough Moshe Halbertal talked about yesterday, the way in which the Bible operated in order to bring about the category of the human and the sacredness of the human at the foundation, as the foundation of what we mean with human rights. So not a coincidence at all. I also see this reference, this quotation, as an implicit indication by Dani Karavan that the concept of human rights itself, the tradition, the discourse of human rights itself, is not sufficient alone, that we need other traditions, we need other sources to turn to when we reflect about what it means to be human today. As important as the declaration is, it remains insufficient, and we need to expand it by other traditions and other notions. And again, the basis of where we go to, or the point of departure we need to return to, is the sacredness of human life, lo tirtzach. Now, I'd like to conclude by going back to Karavan himself and to bring to us some of his words on the day of the inauguration of his way of human rights. And I think those words I'll bring to you are both very moving and really stand for the person Dani Karavan was and Dani Karavan is, because even if Dani Karavan is no longer with us, I do see his legacy and certainly his artwork as remaining with us. So when he's delivering his words at the inauguration ceremony, he goes back to Anne Frank, saying the following words: "I take you by the hand, little Anne Frank. At that time, I was younger than you, and we walk together on this very street to the third column and the third article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we read the Dutch inscription: everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. And I see children, many children, whose right to life has not been observed." Now, interestingly, his point of departure here is Anne Frank, but his gesture is to the ways in which the rights of children, even after that moment of history, after that moment of Anne Frank, the rights of children are being deprived, taken away from them. So for him, this is not just about history, it's not just about the past, but it's also about the contemporary challenge to protect human rights and to make sure that the rights of children and others to live in security and in liberty and in dignity is maintained. Now, shifting his register in the same address he delivered, he then turns to the theological or philosophical question, asking, and this is a quote from his words then and there, is there still a God in spite of what has happened? Are we humans made in his image? This is how he concludes his address. And as we see here, at the center of his understanding of what his artwork means is really this notion of humans as created in the image, B'Tselem. Again, going back to the Bible, going back to antiquity, going back to Genesis 1:26-27, Karavan urges us here in 1993 and in his work in Nuremberg, and I would say in his work as a whole, he encourages us, he urges us to go back to that biblical tradition and to take it as seriously as we can, and to ask ourselves, are we made in his image? We can be religiously committed or not, but think of this provocation, take it seriously, and consider what it means to you today. Of course, resort to the very important modern discourse of human rights, adopt it, debate it, but please don't stop there alone. And on that note, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amir. we have been gleaning from Ruth from the fields of Ruth to the fields of concrete of Dani Karavan, from Abraham to Moses. And now the speakers have the chance to respond to each other. Unfortunately, we won't have much time, but I'm sure the thoughts that arose during this incredible panel will stay with us throughout the evening and the coming time. So please, Ilana, I'm sure you'll want to respond to your fellow panelists.
Thank you, Chiara. I would love to respond, to each and every one of you, but given that time is so limited, I guess this panel in particular deals with reception of human rights, and literary and artistic reception. So we're sort of moving into another sphere, and so this is a question to all of you of what does literature, what does art, what kind of role do art and literature have, both in highlighting the human dimension and in, I'm sort of tying a few things that you've said, and the power or the need, the urgency of thinking of human rights on the one hand, and testing the limits, or wondering about the utopian dimension. If I think about Vivian, the limits of this vision, and how does it, what kind of impact does it have on our lives, both as individual and when we think of a larger kind of society or cultural context in which we live. So this is a very broad question, but here it is.
Vivian, maybe you want to respond?
I want to think further the big question Ilana asked, and that we in our panel are all confronting. What is it that art and that literature can do? And I had a very moving moment when listening to the others who addressed this, because I realized that I'm very much brought up on the critical theory. In my youth, it was Adorno and company above all. And while I was writing my own text, I thought, I had this sentence by Adorno in mind, in jedem wahren Kunstwerk steckt, es kann anders sein als so, or something like that. In every genuine artwork, there is the sense that things can be different than they are. So there is this idea of being critical, of contesting, that is omnipresent in my own sense of art. And yet I felt, while listening to Ilana, while listening to Ofer in a very different way, and now with Amir, that there is something that works differently than that kind of very rational and even approach, because
what does poetic license provide us with?
And just a poetic, Ilana. There was a moment in which I was simply moved in a way that I feel that I don't let myself, because it sometimes touches on the sentimental, and I know that this is something that I don't really let myself, and I felt it very strongly in all three of you, that I can, and I was happy that I can get touched by it, and I want to thank you for this. That works differently. It's just like, wow. And that was very, very special for me. Thank you.
Ofer, would you like to intervene on this line of thought, maybe, or with a new question?
Very, very briefly, I thought what would have happened if Moin was here, because he always cautions about, that literature is not very important. But what Ilana and Vivian have said is something about the possibilities of literature and art. And I'm thinking with, Dorit Cohn, the distinction of fiction. It doesn't mean that literature or sculpture, for that matter, are privileged in some kind of way, but there is some narratorial capacity that engenders something which is alternative. So that's what I have in mind right now. So curious what others have to say. Amir, please.
So thank you, Ilana, thank you, Vivian, and Ofer for your words. Yesterday Richard Rorty's name was mentioned, and I think his thought is somewhere where we could turn to, especially his idea regarding metaphor and the way in which metaphoric language is operative way beyond the realm of literature and the arts. So if we think of literature and the arts as the birthplace of metaphors, the birthplace of figurative language, then as they reverberate through various areas of our lives, including the realm of politics, including the realm of ethics, those metaphors become active and become meaningful and shape the world in various ways. And I see our various contributions today in the panel, but throughout these 2 days, as explicating this idea and to think about biblical metaphors and their various reverberations as they become operative in the world, and of course maintain also the utopian dimension, the idea that we never quite arrive. We never quite arrive, in the place Isaiah wants us to arrive. Yeah. But it's important to have that dimension, and literature and the arts bring us this dimension, bring it, into our lives and into our various conversations.
Thank you all. And as the theme of incompleteness was the central theme, I think, of the panel and of the question of human rights and how to complete them, to reach them over time, time and again. Also, our panel will remain incomplete of the discussion it would have deserved. I'm sure each one will continue the discussion in other settings. And now it's time for the concluding remarks by Leora Batnitzky, and with this I give her the word. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you very much to everyone. What a panel to end on. So thank you. This has been a wonderful conference, and Amir, I really appreciated your words that something very special has been created over at least the last 10 years in the work that Ilana, Vivian, and I have done. And I think I speak for the three of us when I say that we try very carefully to assemble a group that really wants to work together, be interdisciplinary, and really speak to each other. And so it's really, whatever the successes have been, it's been because of the people who have participated. So thank you to everyone. So I'm going to just make some very brief remarks now that we've finished, and I won't take too long at all. So I was looking back at the poster, and I saw that we do have titles for all of the papers, but we didn't have titles for the sessions. So I want to suggest that actually I'm going to give the sessions titles now and see how it all hung together. And we'll see that there, papers in other sessions also spoke to some of the themes in sessions that people weren't in. So our first session, I think I want to suggest, really was about the meaning of the title of the conference, the Bible and human rights. The question of the conjunction, should we be saying Bible and human rights or Bible or human rights? We heard a number of perspectives on this. Sam Moyne gave a very strong caution about the overly conflating the Bible and human rights. And we heard, I think, some interesting pushback throughout the conference in a variety of ways. Naftali pushed back to say, it doesn't have to just be a one-way street in terms of thinking about the Bible as something that is other, but that also, and as we've seen, especially in this last panel, we do have this whole issue of reception. So even the historical question is more complicated. We heard from Elida that there are, in some biblical sources, precursors to human rights. And we heard from Moshe Halbertal, of course, that before we even ask the question about what is the relationship between the Bible and human rights, we need to ask the question of what is the human? And we've just heard more about that. When we turn to the second panel, I think that the title of that panel was perhaps, what do we mean by rights? And so that was interesting for a variety of reasons. And I think Shai and Sharon really gave us a really interesting way of thinking about the inadequacies of contemporary notions of human rights. And basically the argument had to do with this question of what Shai called, he called it tradition, Sharon called it heritage. And I think Sharon made a number of comments in particular that I think tie a number of our papers together. So Sharon, I hope I'm quoting you correctly. You said that, well, we should not be focusing on me and now. That's what human rights focus on in this very abstract way, but on us and the future. We don't just have rights. If we think we deserve something, we should ask for it. And so this asking for it, or this theme of agency, was a theme that came up a lot in various papers and in surprising ways, because one wouldn't necessarily think in advance that the Bible would be the place to find sources of human agency, which really goes also to something Vivian was saying in terms of Arendt's criticisms of Kierkegaard, who at least in Fear and Trembling, where what really faith is about not having agency, about giving God all the agency. But just as a couple of examples of agency, we had, of course, Arendt, for whom Abraham was an agent. We have Ruth, who was an agent as well, in saying what she needed. Ofer gave us a very interesting reading of Kochak and the way in which the orphan can become an agent. And I'm sure I'm missing a few, but I thought it was extremely interesting how often this issue of agency came up. The third panel, I would say, should be titled, "What do we mean by the Bible?" So if the second said, "What do we mean by rights?" the third said, "What do we mean by the Bible?" And here we heard really a variety of really interesting topics, and also different approaches. I mean, of course, we've had philosophical approaches, historical approaches, literary approaches. We also have an empirical approach here. I think I'm right in calling this an empirical approach, sort of this use of data science to try and track biblical sources. I think one of the really interesting things that came up with that has to do with, again, what do we mean by the Bible in terms of, say, a cultural reference versus an exact citation? And that was really interesting, because I think one of the things Renana and Avi showed was that actually in some cases an idiomatic use of the Bible can actually be truer to the text than a non-idiomatic use of the Bible. And so this I think just raises some very interesting questions about text and reception. On the issue of culture, I think Edna really brought up some very important topics in terms of Israel and the Declaration of Independence and the way in which the prophets are used. So here we have a question of how is the Bible specifically used, even a particular theme like the prophets, where they're used to talk about freedom of speech, but not to speak about cultural or artistic freedom. And of course, that links very much to our last panel on the role of culture and the role of cultural freedom. Naftali, among other things, reminded us that the biblical text it's not just that it's not monolithic, but that it builds on itself. Things change. So we don't really get a clear sense of this prohibition against murder in until Genesis 9, and the differences between 1 and 9, and the relationship between the rights of human beings and the rights of animals was also something very important to add. So finally, I'll come to the last panel, which really I was going to title it anyway, but I think I don't remember if it was Ilana or Vivian who gave it this title. Before I did, what can literature and art do? Okay, and we've heard excellent answers here. I want to just maybe mention a couple that were not mentioned, but in our very latest iteration. Literature can escape stereotypes, escape reduction, and that this doesn't lead to normative or arbitrary distortions. Now, my final remark really has to do with two issues that came up that I thought were also surprising. Again, one of the issues I want to highlight just again, this issue of agency, which was very surprising to see how often different speakers refer to particular biblical figures in terms of agency. But two other issues. I was really struck by how often children came up. Okay, Sharon, Naphtali, Ofer, Amir. Also in terms of Ilana, I think Ruth, it's implicit there, the notion of children. And so that's a very interesting issue to think about, how the different biblical texts really allow us to wonder in contemporary human rights discourse where children are. And where the family is, not just in terms of, as Sharon said yesterday, the two partners in marriage, but the family as a unit that, of course, includes children. Finally, I want to end on something that I think Amir said, which I think is very important and also something surprising that comes out of this conference, which is that can the Bible actually be a text or a resource that can transcend the religious and the secular? And that's surprising, of course, because there are many people, maybe some of them are with us or have been with us in the last 2 days, who would say, of course, that's the whole problem, is the Bible is religious and human rights are secular. But I think what we saw again and again was the way in which the biblical text actually speaks to secular sensibilities just as much as it speaks to religious sensibilities, how there is within many different biblical texts a call to protest. And maybe I'll just throw in here to protest what human beings do to one another, but even also a protest to God, who doesn't always deliver what God said God would deliver, specifically in terms of justice. So I think that's all I will say here. I think that we can go back and fill in the poster now. Thank you everyone for an enormously stimulating 2 days.
Thank you, Leora, for a brilliant concluding remark session. And thank you all and for being with us in the past 2 days. Hope next time we'll meet in person. I'd like to thank Jan again for his help, and Atara. So until next year.
And I also want to thank Leora for this. She left out one person, a very important one, and a very important contribution, which is Leora Batnitzky, who showed us that if nothing else, the Bible is certainly a forerunner and a prefiguration of knowing that there are many limitations and many things that cannot be done and maybe cannot even be resolved, but that we are on a building site and that we're all there together, and there's something to that.
You can see the mountain at the distance, Okay.
Thank you, Vivian.
Thank
I was
you.
getting very worried.
Thanks, Ilana. Thanks, Leora.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Vivian.
Thank you very much.